In 2021, DC's chief creative officer Jim Lee stated that Superman no longer stood for truth, justice, and the American way, but rather stood for truth, justice, and a better tomorrow. This was reflective, Jim Lee argued, of the current reality of Superman as a figure who pushed the world to be better than it currently was. But, as with all changes in comic books, it caused some controversy.
And so this says, this is a tweet, obviously screenshots. So it says, Dean Cain, who played Superman in the Superman show. I promise you, as Superman, I wouldn't today be allowed to say truth, justice, and the American way.
Of course, what a lot of people might not realize is that the motto, truth, justice, and the American way, isn't from the comics initially. Rather, it came from the Superman radio serial as part of the war effort, returning later for the George Reeves Adventures of Superman TV show.
Fights a never-ending battle for truth, justice, and the American way.
These two adaptations of Superman comics spread the idea, more than any other piece of Superman media, that Superman represented the American dream, establishing Superman as an American icon, arguably far more than the less subtle Captain America. But while the phrase truth, justice, and American way might be iconic today, it wasn't really employed all that much, even in adaptations. Now, the Christopher Reeve Superman says he fights for truth, justice, and American way in his initial film.
I'm here to fight for truth and justice and the American way.
You're gonna end up fighting every elected official in this country.
But strangely, in the show Lois and Clark, which stars the noteworthy right-wing actor Dean Cain, Superman doesn't say he fights for the American way. He fights for truth and justice, but not the American way. Adaptations like Superman Returns have irony-poisoned characters like Perry White dismiss the motto.
Politics, does he still stand for truth, justice, all that stuff?
While Zack Snyder's Man of Steel completely ignores it exists. So it shouldn't surprise anyone that a catchphrase that's barely been used by Superman in the last 30 years is being replaced. Though, interestingly enough, it has been used since the announcement it's being replaced, but I digress. Except for one very noteworthy story, they used it quite well. What's so funny about truth, justice, and the American way? It's a story where Superman is confronted by Manchester Black, a rogue anti-hero who believes Superman's mercy and idealism is a weakness rather than a strength, who believes that Superman fights for a corrupt country rather than a dream. Now, Black's methods are far more permanent and brutal, one might say, and Superman confronts Black and his crew, the elite, by pretending to use the same means they use on others against them, demonstrating how easy it could be for Superman to use his power to permanently end crime like they do. It's just, he chooses not to. Manchester Black at one point taunts Superman, insisting he represents not the American way, but the American right-wing military complex, a force of colonialism that dominates the rest of the world under the might of the red, white, and blue flag. But here's the thing. The story isn't about the American military might or Western colonialism. It's about the American way. The story leaves us on this final interaction between Manchester Black and Superman. Black argues that Superman's methods are a fantasy, one that can never actually have a positive impact on the world, while Superman argues right back, in a more declarative final voice, that dreams and optimism bring the world hope, and that the possibility of a better tomorrow can help change the present day, push us further along the path to progress. So even stories where they talk about the American way, it's not that Superman sees himself as a representative of America, but rather an emblematic feature of the American dream. So what is that? What is the American way that aligns itself so closely with truth and justice? When the motto was first made in the 40s, the phrase, the American way, brought a very different idea than it does 80 years later. Superman's American way catchphrase was originally created during World War II, an era of hyper-patriotism in response to the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Superman stood in opposition to the enemies of America, and a lot of superhero serials at the time featured iconic cape heroes fighting representatives of Japan, Germany, and Italy, though mostly Japan, or something suitably foreign and unknown, such is the case in The Adventures of Captain Marvel, the first superhero adaptation where Captain Marvel fights an evil scientist in Siam, now Thailand. But when it came time for Superman to be in the serials, he fought villains. The second serial, Atom Man vs. Superman, pitted Lex Luthor against Superman. The first film, a generic villain. Not Nazis or America's enemies, but Superman's enemies. People who were greedy, who wanted to subjugate the weak. Batman served in serials more to enact America's military structure than Superman. So why is Superman labeled the all-American hero? The embodiment of the American way? Well, simply put, the American way is vastly different than the American military complex. Jerry Siegel and Joel Shuster, the creators of Superman, based their creation on three things: the science fiction that they were growing up with, stars in films they loved such as Harold Lloyd, and their own lives. Lois Lane, for example, was designed after a model who would later become Jerry Siegel's wife. Siegel and Shuster would base the fact that Clark wore glasses on the fact that they both wore glasses.
Both Joe and I, wear glasses, most of the time. And it occurred to me that there was no adventure comic strip hero at that time who wore glasses, so I thought it would be quite different to have Clark Kent wear glasses. And also, the wearing of glasses gives the impression of meekness and mildness, which goes into Harold Lloyd, the influence of Harold Lloyd on us and his movies. We were both great movie fans, and we especially loved some of those movies in which Harold Lloyd would start off as a sort of mama's boy, being pushed around, kicked around, thrown around, and then suddenly would turn into a fighting whirlwind.
They would model Superman's expressions after their own faces. And the fact that Superman is an immigrant who lands in America as a baby after the destruction of Krypton, well, that's because Siegel was born from Jewish immigrants, and Shuster was himself an immigrant from Canada, yes, but his family emigrated to Canada from the crumbling Russian Empire. Is it really any surprise that Mario Puzo, the man most famous for drafting the most iconic story about Italian-American immigrants, based on his own experience as an Italian-American, would draft the script for Superman the movie? Is there any shock that it drew this kind of narrative from immigrants who want to tell their story through the fabric of the American mythology itself?
And there's one thing I do know, son, and that is you are here for a reason.
The Kents didn't raise Superman to be a force of power or domination, though Superman could, if he wanted, dominate the entire world, all governments, everyone. He just doesn't. He leads by example.
They can be a great people, Kal-El, they wish to be. They only lack the light to show the way. For this reason, above all, their capacity for good, I have sent them you, my only son.
It's for this reason that some, like Puzo, reinterpreted Superman as a Jesus figure, something Zack Snyder took full advantage of by having Superman drifting around with his arms spread like a cross, or having him appear around stained glass representations of Jesus. But Superman is not Jesus. I think the idea of two Jewish men creating a Jesus allegory is already a misleading statement to make. No, Superman isn't Jesus. He's Moses. He's a refugee from another society, adopted into a new world where he brings revolution to a system riddled with injustice. While he has incredible power, he only uses it under incredible circumstances, instead encouraging others to live by example. I don't necessarily know if this was intentional, but it is what Superman is, and the parallel exists. This right away established something. Superman is a figure who left a dying world, arrived in a new world, willing to welcome him, where he could achieve his dreams and add value to the world. In effect, this is the American dream circa 1930, that anyone can come here and make something of themselves to make the world a better place. It's why people immigrated here. It's why people come here. A dream. But a dream is often muddied by reality. And indeed, Superman immediately, in real life and in fiction, found himself in conflict. The American dream conflicting with the American reality.
Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster no longer own Superman. In 1938, they sold the rights for $130 to DC Comics, now a division of Warner Communications. They own the new feature films, Superman 1 and 2. Siegel and Shuster had to stand by and watch their creation become a multi-million-dollar industry.
And this is the complicated paradox of Superman. What is the American dream? And where does the American way transition into our cruel real life. In the comics, Superman enlisted in the US military during the World War II war effort. Superman became a representative of America, urging American kids to buy stamps and invest in the military structure to aid in the war effort.
There can only be one Superman, of course. Did you ever think about some of the super things that you can do for yourself? Well, like saving up the money for your own vacation, or for that new bike that you wanted so much. Well, all you have to do is just put away part of your allowance or your odd job money and put it in United States savings stamps at school.
In Superman's 2 serials, which were made after World War II, however, Superman just fights a generic villain and Lex Luthor, which, hey, great! But the radio specials after World War II moved on to a different target, one that their Superman could fight, an enemy to the American people. And again, keep in mind, the radio broadcast was the first place to embrace the motto, truth, justice, and the American way. So, their Superman targeted the most un-American force they could think of, the most dangerous thing to the average American civilian. Something that was destroying the foundation of American society at its core. Superman went from fighting Nazis to fighting the Klan.
Well, did you hear that, brothers in the Klan? That young whelp who is not a true American, who can never be a true American, tried to kill this fatherless American boy. And why? Because he has been schooled by his kind and their foreign sympathizers to strike against our plans for a pure, clean America. An American free from mixed races, mixed colors, and mixed religions.
But they didn't just fight him in a fictional setting. The radio broadcast fought the Klan in American reality, and brought about a massive change that we are still feeling the ramifications of to this day, for better.
Jim Olsen hurries out after Clark Kent, still puzzled by the reason for the un-American attack on Tommy Lee's family. Why are these people the object of the vicious secret band's fanatical hatred? And what will happen to the Lees and to Jim Olsen if this grim, cowardly warning of intolerance is ignored?
A little background on the Superman radio show, The Adventures of Superman, as it was called. It was started in 1940, very soon after the character's debut in Action Comics #1, and ended in 1951. In those first 5 years, Superman consistently fought enemies of America, specifically the Nazis and Japan. Its audience primarily consisted of kids whose dads were off fighting and moms who were helping with the war effort at home. World War II really dominated all aspects of American life at that time, and so the show was escapism. It also offered American propaganda, but again, I think most people agree the Nazis were objectively bad in World War II, so propaganda away in this case. That said, the racist depiction of the Japanese people on those serials, it's, well, the less said the better. And when the war ended, they really had nothing else for Superman to fight. The show rose to popularity because Superman was the embodiment of America during this conflict, beating down America's greatest enemies. I think the creatives realized that they needed to target a new enemy of the American way. And so, in 1946, they aired the 15-part radio serial, The Clan of the Fiery Cross.
Last night, a burning cross was planted on our front lawn by a bunch of men wearing hoods and gowns.
In it, an Asian American family is targeted by the Klan, and the family's son reaches out to Superman for help. Now, this already would make for a compelling story, but what makes this serial important not just in terms of Superman's history, but in terms of American history, is the contributions of Stetson Kennedy. Kennedy was an author who investigated the Klan. He found a way to sneak into their membership and take account of all their inner workings, from secret operations to hidden code words. He realized quickly, though, that he couldn't take this information to the cops, because the cops were also in on it. There were tons of cops in the Klan. So instead, he took it to the writers of the Superman radio show, who thought it was just too fascinating not to turn into a program. This single radio broadcast completely fragmented the Klan in real life. On the air, they revealed all the secrets to the public, all their code words, all their locations, all their strategies. The Klan targeted the sponsor of the Superman show, Kellogg's, yes, the cereal company, to stop either the writers, the broadcast, or the entire show from airing. But the ratings were just so good, Kellogg refused. They took a stand in the ground and said, no, we are not bending to your pressure. We will continue to air this. And this resulted in the end of the second coming of the Klan in America. People always look at Birth of a Nation as the point where this Klan rose back to prominence, but people forget this broadcast is what stifled their growth immediately. Because the more the public knew about their activities and strategies, the more they could resist and the more they could fight, and the Klan knew this. Public support for them dropped quickly. Who knows what could have happened if that broadcast didn't air and they were allowed to continue growing as a result, corrupting the foundations of America. But one thing Superman avoided being involved in? Vietnam.
Has Superman played a role in other crises that America's been involved in over the years, like Korea, Vietnam?
No, we kept him out of the unpopular war.
Unpopular wars DC deliberately chose to keep Superman out of. The editorial were very careful to avoid linking Superman to problems with America in the 60s and 70s and even 80s.
We have a series of war magazines that we publish and have been publishing for many years. And the war was handled through those magazines only. But we kept saying that these were war stories and war is really hell.
Do you apply a moral code?
We've been very careful in how we handle Superman. I think that it could never have continued over so many years if we didn't watch what we did.
DC was sure to segregate Superman as time went on from the American military, a deliberate choice that helped lend to the longevity of the character. Sergeant Rock, he could be in the military. Superman, not so much. He became an ideal to strive for. Fighting Nazis and the Klan were a part of that. Enforcing American military force in Vietnam? The Cold War effort? Less so. Rather than fight Vietnam, Superman would instead fight Muhammad Ali. This is entirely unlike Iron Man and Captain America, who Marvel did lean into the Cold War when writing. Iron Man fought tons of Cold War era villains representing Russia and China, the Crimson Dynamo, the Mandarin, all of that. Captain America, meanwhile, revoked his own title of Captain America in part due to repulsion of the American military efforts in Vietnam. This is history. This is a thing that the comics did. These two characters represented the diverging political landscape of America in the 60s and 70s. But Superman, again, he stood for the American way, not the American history that he was living through. He would always feel a little detached from what was going on because he represented the dream of America being better, of Americans being better. Except for one time. One comic did put Superman as a representative of the American government. How Superman could compromise his ethics in the name of the American way abroad. And unfortunately, this comic has become one of the most influential comics of all time, and it has one of the worst depictions of Superman ever. While the comic is great, its Superman served to ruin the public's perception of who Superman was and what truth, justice, and the American way represented to the character of Superman. When people echo Manchester Black and say Superman is just a toady for the American government, they're usually thinking about the Superman as seen in The Dark Knight Returns by Frank Miller. Miller's Superman is... there's no two ways about this. Miller does not get Superman. His Superman is horrendous. In The Dark Knight Returns, Superman is basically an enforcer for an aging Ronald Reagan. He's essentially a blue Boy Scout who serves as an extension of the American military, who is sent to bring Batman down due to his refusal to subject himself to government oversight, or rather, government control. In effect, he is taking the same position Iron Man took during Marvel's Civil War, and I think saying that Superman took the same position as hyper-capitalist Tony Stark, that's a sign you're writing Superman wrong right there. That said, Frank Miller's Superman would only get worse and worse as time went on. I mean, again, Frank Miller's work got worse and worse as time went on, but his Superman especially became worse and worse and worse. At least in The Dark Knight Returns, Superman and Batman had a mutual respect of some kind. They liked each other deeply. But as Frank expanded his alternate version of Batman with The Dark Knight Strikes Again, and All-Star Batman and Robin, it became clear that Superman was at best a control-obsessed monster, or a sociopath, who was completely detached from human reality, from human nature. He didn't care about people, he cared about the mission and control of a situation. It's hard to say how much Frank did this intentionally or not, considering that Miller is far from consistent when writing his characters, even within the same book. How much did Frank Miller intend to make Superman this military toady, an avatar of the American military? And how much did he intend on Batman, by contrast, to become almost a fascist dream, dominating Gotham with an iron fist, controlling all elements of it in order to maintain peace and order? That strength through a singular vision is somehow a strong thing. It's hard to say how much Frank Miller intended it, and how much people can read into the work as a result of it being The Dark Knight Returns. But I digress. We really don't know. What we do know is that Superman is written in an uncharacteristic fashion, where he's basically a toady to an aging Ronald Reagan. The Dark Knight Returns version of Superman, I think, ruined the way that a certain niche of people saw Superman. Like with most things in comics, it was widely read in the niche of comic book fans, of superhero fans, and as a result got spread on the early forum scene back when the internet first started up. It was pushed around in magazines at the time, and so it influenced the public's perception of Superman. And as a result, people who read those magazines, were on those forums, well, they are the people who wrote the scripts for what came after that. How do you make your hero, who's mortal, who's vulnerable, more appealing, compared to Superman? Have Superman be the unrealistic standard to which you compare your hero. Because after all, he can never live up to Superman. And so his problems will then feel more real. Sam Raimi's Spider-Man does this.
You're not Superman, you know.
Batman and Robin does this.
This is why Superman works alone.
And accordingly, there came the parodies of Superman, to show how Superman would be if he were quote-unquote realistic. Omni-Man from Invincible, Homelander from The Boys, even, to a lesser extent, Marvel's Sentry or Gladiator. Even DC has a few of these, with alternate reality versions of Superman like Ultraman, the Red Sun timeline, where Superman lands in Soviet Russia instead of Kansas, or the Injustice timeline, where after Joker manages to blow up Metropolis and trick Superman into killing Lois Lane with Scarecrow fear poison, Superman becomes a dictator of the world, reigning in crime with a fascist regime. And this became the face of Superman. I think directly because of Frank Miller, the first guy to critically twist Superman around like this as a stooge for America, we began to take the American way and confuse it with the worst aspects of the American military during the Cold War, and later on, the War on Terror. While other characters of Captain America would take these real-life conflicts and use it to evolve the dynamic the character had with his country, Superman felt divorced from that. He was following not the reality of the military, but a dream. A singular dream. But did it work? I think to counterbalance the narrative that I'm just talking about, works began to push harder against the idea that Superman was just a stooge for the government, because he never really was in the comics. Superman always fought tyrants and those who would oppress the small and vulnerable. Brainiac harvest and shrank cities for his own curiosity. Mongol ran an intergalactic empire, a dictatorship of his own making. And Darkseid, well, Darkseid reigned as a god of evil itself. A true tyrant. How can it get worse than that? But ask anyone who Superman's arch enemy is, and was, it would always come down to one guy.
Lex Luthor, the greatest criminal mind of our time.
Now, for the Silver and Bronze Age, Luthor was a demented scientist with ambitions of world domination and power, who would create these elaborate schemes to ensnare Superman and gain power in society. But after Crisis on Infinite Earths, characters were redesigned, reinvented for the modern era, and Lex Luthor was maybe reinvented the best out of everyone. He was no longer a mad scientist working on the underground of society, reigning in the Injustice League's dens. Rather, he was a corrupt businessman, a billionaire. He saw himself as a gift from God to the world. But Superman was a threat to his ego. I mean, his position of authority, I mean to say. Yes. Superman made all human accomplishment seem meaningless by comparison. What's the point of working hard when a man can be born with immense power like Superman? And Lex, he felt threatened by that. I mean, he was protecting humanity's interests. His ego wasn't at all threatened by the presence of a man who could jump a building in a single bound. No, or take a flying bullet to the face. No. Lex was in humanity's defense. He was on humanity's side.
Feel that, Kent. Real muscle. Not the gift of alien biochemistry, the product of hard work.
He was fighting Superman for the sake of mankind. Because how can we allow this all-powerful alien just run amok in society? right? That's what he wanted, right?
Next to Superman, even Lex Luthor's greatness is overshadowed.
Again, pre-Crisis, Lex represented the evil potential of mankind. A genius who used his gifts for selfish ends, who held court with other villains to gain power. But post-Crisis, we saw that Lex had all the power any human being could ever want. And he still felt small standing beside Superman. And he couldn't deal with it. Lex Luthor, in many ways, now stood as a parallel to Bruce Wayne, or even Tony Stark, in that they were both these brilliant men, these rich genius billionaires who used their wealth to enact an agenda of a grand nature. It just so happened that Lex's agenda was to destroy Superman out of his own petty sense of envy and jealousy for the things Superman had inherently. So how does this factor into the American way and Superman? Well, Lex represented the American reality. That some people can achieve their dreams, but on the way to the top, they kick people down all the way down the ladder. Lex was given great privilege, great power, great money, and used that to cut off the ability for others to reach their goals. He hurt innocent people all along the way to bettering himself, all the while making himself out to be this example of what people can be if they just tried hard enough. It's essentially late-stage capitalism. He got his power by exploiting others, by abusing people through the systems that were legal, that existed, and then subverting that legal system to further get more power, all the while framing himself as this great man. And nowhere is that more clear than during No Man's Land and Luthor's subsequent election as President of the United States. Lex Luthor becoming President of the United States, I don't need to tell you that's bad. Now granted, Luthor became president in part thanks to how he helped rebuild Gotham in the wake of No Man's Land, an event where Gotham was completely decimated in a freak earthquake. Crime spread throughout the streets of Gotham, gangs rose up, the police and Batman were helpless to save Gothamites from the rising tides of crime. And Luthor came in to rebuild the city. But granted, he didn't come in to rebuild because he was just the right guy at the right time. He kept relief efforts from reaching Gotham, so he could instead go in and provide relief efforts. He prevented reconstruction from occurring until he had his name plastered over it. He was not doing this out of altruistic joy or a need to help the common man, but rather a desire to promote his brand as Lex Luthor, which he leveraged to become president. Now, Lex was fairly elected. Superman didn't protest the results of the election, though he never trusted Luthor, and for good reason. See, Luthor promised to share his immense wealth and technology with the American people, placing a flying car in every garage, a clear and direct satire of the Republican Party's slogan during the election of Herbert Hoover. A chicken in every pot, and a car in every garage. Now, in case you forgot your American history, it is because of Hoover that the Great Depression occurred. And even more concerning, it wasn't even their phrase originally. Henry IV from France said a chicken in every pot first, though I don't think he predicted the car in every garage part, considering that he said this in the 16th century. Now, add to that, Luthor's cabinet included General Sam Lane and Amanda Waller. We'll get to them later when we discuss My Adventures with Superman. Luthor as president then used the resources of the United States to elevate his own status and fight the Imperiex War, before turning his attention once again, as it always will be, on Superman, the one threat to his authority. Now, when a kryptonite meteorite hit the Earth, Lex used the tragedy as leverage to motivate the American government to target Superman, who he blamed for the disaster. Lex Luthor represents the very thing that Manchester Black was complaining Superman represented, verbatim. He is the same sort of authority figure Frank Miller said Superman bowed to. And yet in the comics, Luthor is the enemy of Superman. He's a tyrant, using his power for selfish ends. It doesn't matter where he comes from. A tyrant is a tyrant. It could be an alien in space or seated in the Oval Office. If you abuse the power that you earn, Superman will face you and return power to those who deserve it most. To protect the vulnerable, the downtrodden. To work for truth, justice, and the American way. A way that has no kings, a way that has no dictators in charge. That's the American way. and Luthor stood in opposition to it. Very transparently the comics, as a complete in contrast to The Dark Knight Returns, where Ronald Reagan plays a very similar role that Luthor plays in the mainstream DC comics. Yes, Reagan was a real person, and thus we have to apply the real standards of history to him. It's a little easier to say no kings and tyrants with a fictional president than a real president. Oh, and by the way, while the President Luthor plot was going on in the main comics, The Dark Knight Strikes Again, Frank Miller's sequel to the influential The Dark Knight Returns, came out. In The Dark Knight Strikes Again, Lex Luthor steals the presidency by replacing the president with a hologram and blackmails Superman, Wonder Woman, and Captain Marvel into subservience by threatening to destroy the bottled city of Kandor with Brainiac for some reason. Just compare the two, how Superman reacted to Luthor winning a fair election and becoming a president to Luthor stealing the Oval Office. Which one do you think is a betrayal of Superman's uncompromising morality and ethos? Superman does not bow to whoever is in charge of a country. Rather, he wants to make sure that everyone has a chance at happiness. A chance to pursue their dreams and add value to the world. The pursuit of happiness. And other adaptations continued this full well. In Zack Snyder's Superman, with Man of Steel, Batman v Superman, and even Justice League, Superman does work with the American military to fight Zod. And the Martian Manhunter literally works behind the scenes in the military for his own ends. But Superman acts as he sees fit, without regards for borders or regulations. He does the right thing on his own terms, even though the world at large grows to fear him. Something that Luthor himself exploits in Batman v Superman. While he subjects himself to the American government's authority, he does so for mankind's comfort, not because he actually thinks that they deserve to govern over him.
You let them handcuff you?
Wouldn't be much of a surrender if I resisted, and if it makes them feel more secure, then all the better for it.
While Snyder's depiction of Superman is problematic for many reasons, that core is inherently Superman standing for the American way, right then and there. Though they scoff at it and avoid mentioning it, it is still the core element of Superman that is still present in Man of Steel. Though Snyder does lift heavily from Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns, at no point is Superman ever a stooge like he is in The Dark Knight Returns, even when copying scenes directly from The Dark Knight Returns. Superman is treated constantly as this outsider in Zack Snyder's world. He's generally accepted once people know he's one of the good aliens. You know, one of the good ones. But he's still treated like an outsider by many, even Batman and especially Lex Luthor. Over time, Superman finds acceptance in Zack Snyder's DCEU. This is not the case, however, with My Adventures with Superman.
Who are you? And why are you on Earth?
I don't know. My Adventures with Superman is one of my all-time favorite adaptations of the character Superman. No other series, I think, adapts Superman's kindness, empathy, and genuine human nature better than this one.
How did you know you'd be bulletproof?
I didn't. I just knew that you weren't.
In regards to Superman as a representative of the American way, the show does a lot of things very interesting that I want to discuss. Superman's primary adversary throughout the entire series is the United States government. Now, previously, General Sam Lane, Lois Lane's dad, and Amanda Waller had to fend off invading Kryptonian forces who had arrived on Earth briefly before being stopped. Now, these forces, we find out later, were led by Brainiac, who had taken over the Kryptonian technology after destroying all of Krypton, with only Kara Zor-El, the last Kryptonian aside from Kal-El, remaining as his primary enforcer. Though, to be his enforcer, she's erased of all her personal agency and even her free will. Brainiac has become a dictator over the remnants of Krypton, and because of that, the American government fears all Kryptonians, especially Superman. So, naturally, they've treated Superman as an invading army, a force from another world crossing over borders to infest and demolish the American way of life. Superman is quite literally an illegal alien, and is treated as a representative of an invading force despite the fact that he knows nothing about his home heritage. And so he's pitted against Sam Lane, the father of the girl he loves, Amanda Waller, who is a sociopath to put it mildly, And also Lex Luthor, he's there too. In the process, several classic DC characters are reinterpreted as enforcers of the government, or capitalism, with Parasite becoming this corrupt business owner, this corrupt business executive who gains power by draining people beneath him, sucking them dry till bones remain. Or Deathstroke the Terminator, who becomes a major enforcer of Task Force X, a stooge of the government.
Who are you? Oh, that's easy, Superman. We're the good guys.
Much like how Superman was in Dark Knight Returns. Yet despite all this, Superman represents the very same thing he represented in the comics all this time. He just wants to protect those who matter. The defenseless, the vulnerable. At the end of the day, Superman just wants to protect those who need protection. Every time, always. Even his enemies he shows sympathy for. Those who choose to remain his villains do so because they want power or wealth at the expense of others. And no matter how many times Superman shows mercy, they refuse the olive branch and instead choose to hurt people more and more. The easy path to success versus the hard path that helps better the world. The problem is not that Superman has changed. He's been consistent. He's the same person we had in the 30s, no matter what else changed about his powers, his costumes, etc., who writes them, who draws them. Yes, Frank Miller can ruin the character in his own little way, but the character remains still beyond Miller. He stands for the same core values he did in the 30s. The difference is we call these old-fashioned now, but these values are universal. Support those who are vulnerable, oppose those who want to hurt the vulnerable. Truth, justice, the American way. It just so happens that these things we call the American way, they were formed in an era where we opposed the Nazis. But those values are now called a better tomorrow. The same values that drove us to fight oppression is now tomorrow's dream. You'd think a better tomorrow would come sooner, but Superman has always represented that mankind can be better than we currently are, that we can progress further than we currently are. The comics today don't always succeed at showing us this. There are famous moments, of course, where they don't write Superman perfectly well. The Over There speech, for example, in the JMS comic Superman Grounded, very famous speech, where Superman argues that we can only take care of our place here. If we prevent evil from happening here, that's enough. Sure, a criminal might leave and go over there, but as JMS says through Superman, over there will just have to take care of itself. Which, no, that's not how it works, actually. Superman is not about taking care of here and letting over there take care of its own problems. See, Superman's idea of protecting the innocent and vulnerable has nothing to do with geographic location. This isn't Candide by Voltaire, where we're tending to our own gardens. No. Superman is a hero for everyone, everywhere. This isn't about the realities of protecting a community. Superman isn't Spider-Man or Luke Cage, where they're their local, friendly neighborhood hero, where they have to defend the neighborhood from threats within and without. No, Superman is a hero for the planet Earth. He's the idea that goodness transcends borders. There is no limitation to Superman's jurisdiction because everywhere needs a hero who can stand up alongside them. People who argue Superman's altruism is conditional, that he only cares about a certain type of person and not another, is antithetical to who Superman is. But this mentality is pervasive in modern discussion about Superman. Because a huge chunk of people don't actually read comics, however, relatively small stories that gain publicity become huge talking points even in mainstream publications like Fox News and the Wall Street Journal. Such as John Kent, Superman's son, a recent character, coming out as bisexual. This was reported by multiple outlets as Superman becoming bisexual. Superman being Clark Kent, not John Kent, who is a totally different character. Great journalism skills there, buddy. But this is nothing new. Action Comics 900 saw Superman revoke his American citizenship in a story penned by David S. Goyer, the same writer who worked on Batman Begins and Man of Steel, and Blade 3, but let's not talk about that. Now, in context, the story makes sense. Superman is confronted about how his actions in other countries might be seen internationally as acts of American aggression. So Superman becomes a citizen of the world instead of one singular country to show how his actions are not reflective of the military actions of any one nation. It makes sense. In fact, he does this in service of America, to keep them out of trouble internationally. However, when the story dropped, people interpreted it as Superman rejecting America as a country. It got so bad that Chuck Dixon, a comic book author who has written but a lot of Batman and Punisher books, he wrote this op-ed for the Wall Street Journal about how this comic represented the comic industry's descent into liberal propaganda. By the way, in case you're curious, Chuck Dixon now writes for Eric July, who himself works for Glenn Beck's Blaze Media, a right-wing media outlet. Yeah, Dixon, tell us more about political bias in media. What is so ridiculous about all this is that the people sharing this news with you have a clear political bias. They don't read comics and are just trying to stir up controversy for the attention of mainstream audiences who are basically disinterested in who any of these people are unless it intersects with their political worldview. Hell, if anything, they only care about the headline. Superman renouncing his citizenship, as I mentioned, was for America's own good, yet it's reframed by those who didn't read the comic as an act of disgust in the face of America. It's completely taken out of context in a way that's cartoonish. If anyone read the comics, they would know it's complete nonsense. But they don't. Whenever a director of a film, like say James Gunn, makes a statement that's pretty nonchalant, you'll always have at least one foolish, ridiculous grifter making a dumb comment about it.
James Gunn says, battered Superman is a metaphor for the United States of America, and it's not a fascistic power fantasy. What the hell does that mean?
Superman will always topple dictatorships to protect the vulnerable, no matter where those dictatorships might be. He will fight oppression to protect those who are vulnerable, despite who is being oppressed. There is no condition to that statement. He will always value people, regardless of who they are or what they're like. Superman is someone who does not have power that he abuses or uses power to control others. He uses his power to lead by example, to help everyone be the best version of themselves that they are. And a fascistic power fantasy that always oppresses a certain person who you can pin society's problems onto. It is not a return to the past, but a new step forward. A better tomorrow. The problem is people confuse old-fashioned American values with being traditional, as in never breaking the pattern of what came before. But that's not Superman. He is accepting of all people. Because for him, all suffering is the same. All pain is the same. Something you have to push to avoid, to overcome. And in this sense, Superman is the best version of us that we could ever dream of being. He is a better tomorrow. He is indicative of what we can do if we just work together, if we all saw that all suffering is interconnected in some way and fight to eliminate the core root, oppression. The idea that we can use our position in society to better ourselves at the expense of someone else.
Superman stands for truth, justice, and the American way. From the very beginning, from his inception.
Superman sees the world as full of people who are suffering under the thumb of someone powerful and dangerous. And that if we try to help those who are vulnerable find happiness, find joy, that the world could be better. It isn't ideal. It's a dream. It is affected by reality, and several heroes in comics do discuss the reality between the hope of making people better and the difficulties ahead. But Superman doesn't use his powers to just punch the problem. It's not that simple. He uses power to lead by example, to motivate us to follow him. That's what makes Superman so great, and what people don't get about Superman. He is not a tyrant. He can't just take over the world and control it and make us be better. That's what Injustice Superman does, and it's a negative horror story. No. What Superman does is he wants to lead by example, to show that we can love each other. And yet people are so toxic in this world, so angry about that message, so afraid of that message this very day. Why is that? Why are we so afraid of a story where a character says we have to love each other? Why do we fight that constantly? Why is it when the comics bring up someone who is loved, who is different by Superman, we oppose it as a society? We make a big broadcast on Fox News about it. Why do we do that? Why is the message of love so controversial this very day? Perhaps it's because, even in today's society, the idea of truth, justice, the American way is still a controversial statement. Something that people who claim they embody these American ways hates more than anything else. Perhaps the big thing is that we treat kindness as a controversial act. Well, if that's the case, then we will always need Superman. If we respond to the idea of kindness and love with anger, there will always be a need for someone to bring us closer to the light. There will always be need for a Superman. And that's why stories like What's So Funny About Truth, Justice, and the American Way are so important today. Dreams can elevate us. Dreams can carry us into a better tomorrow. To lead by example so that we can embody some of these, even a fraction of what this man represents in fiction. Fiction is not reality. It can never be reality. But it can motivate us to be better versions of ourselves through the example set by a fictional standard. And I ask you this, as a parting thought, if you love this story of a man who wants to just help people live, then what's stopping us from doing the same thing in today? From doing a small little part to help even over here be better? And if we're all over here, then over there might go nowhere. Or rather, if we all help with our little communities and tend to our own gardens and make it better, over here and over there will be a better place. Following the example of a character over here.
Can you show us what the original Superman looked like?
Here's the pencil sketch of the original Superman. And that was the first cover of the Superman book. That was 1939.
And is that how it actually appeared?
Yeah, that's how he appeared. See?